Every senator in Rome eventually made peace with Caesar. Every single one. Except one man who decided he would rather die than pretend the Republic was still standing. In the final decades of the Roman Republic, as Julius Caesar marched his army toward Rome, and the old order buckled under the weight of one man's ambition, the political class did what political classes have always done when faced with overwhelming force. They adapted, they rationalized. They found reasons why working with the new reality was actually the wise and mature thing to do. Brilliant men, experienced statesmen, people who had spent their careers defending Roman law and tradition. One by one, they came around. His name was Cato the Younger. And the reason most people in power eventually despised him was that he made their compromises visible just by refusing to make his own. Rome, in that era, had a specific kind of corruption. It wasn't crude or obvious. Nobody was walking around in broad daylight, breaking laws and laughing about it. The corruption was more sophisticated than that. It was the kind that dressed itself in the language of practicality. Caesar wasn't seizing power, he was stabilizing a fractured republic. Allying with him wasn't surrender, it was being realistic about what could actually be accomplished given the circumstances. The corruption came wrapped in reasonable-sounding arguments delivered by intelligent people who had genuinely talked themselves into believing what was convenient to believe. You know this environment. It exists in every organization that has ever existed. The boss who runs things in a way that clearly benefits him and calls it strategy. The team that looks the other way on something wrong because raising it would cost them. The unspoken agreement that the people who get ahead are the ones who understand which things are worth fighting about and which things are better left alone. The whole culture organized around a shared pretense that everyone knows is a pretense and nobody says out loud. So what did Cato do when the entire Roman establishment started making their separate accommodations? He had started differently than most Roman politicians. His great-grandfather was Cato the Elder, a legend of Roman austerity and discipline, and the younger Cato absorbed that inheritance like a religion. As a child, he was famously stubborn in a way that alarmed adults. He would take positions and simply not move from them, regardless of pressure or persuasion or social consequence. When other boys competed for status and favor with the adults around them, Cato asked questions and demanded real answers. His tutors found him exhausting. His peers found him strange. He found the whole performance of social approval completely uninteresting. By the time he entered Roman political life, he had cultivated something unusual, a total indifference to what powerful people thought of him. Not the performance of indifference, which is its own kind of vanity, but the real thing. He wasn't trying to seem uncorruptible. He was just genuinely more interested in whether something was right than in whether it was popular. Watch what this produced in practice. When Crassus and Caesar and Pompey formed their alliance and began effectively controlling Roman politics through money and military power, most senators found ways to work within that reality. Cato spent years standing up in the Senate and naming exactly what was happening. Not softened, not qualified, not framed diplomatically. He would speak for hours, literally hours, to delay votes he believed were corrupt. He once talked until dark to prevent a land bill he considered a bribe to Caesar's veterans from passing. He was threatened. He was physically removed from the Senate floor on at least one occasion. He came back and kept talking. He wasn't doing this because he thought it would work in the short term. He knew the numbers. He knew the votes. His point was different. He believed that when an institution is being corrupted, the worst thing that can happen is for everyone to quietly accept it. Not because protest stops the corruption immediately, but because every person who goes along, who stays silent, who decides to be realistic, makes the corruption more total. Cato's refusal was not a strategy. It was a refusal to let what was happening be normalized without someone on record saying no. This is where he becomes genuinely hard to dismiss. Because this wasn't performance, either. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon and the civil war began and Pompey fled Italy and it became clear that resistance was probably futile, Cato kept going. He crossed to Africa. He commanded forces at Utica. He organized the last serious military opposition to Caesar with resources and odds that made victory nearly impossible. And when it finally collapsed, when the last army was defeated and Caesar was coming and his officers were making arrangements to surrender and receive pardon, Cato sat down and read Plato's dialogue about the immortality of the soul, and then died by his own hand rather than accept Caesar's mercy. He refused the pardon specifically. His son survived. His officers survived. Caesar was apparently genuinely willing to forgive. Cato's refusal wasn't about hatred for Caesar personally. It was about what accepting the pardon would mean. It would mean Caesar had the right to grant it. It would mean the Republic was already something Caesar now owned. Accepting survival on those terms was, to Cato, a deeper defeat than death. That is either the most principled act in Roman history or a form of madness. And reasonable people have argued both sides for 2,000 years. What isn't debatable is what it cost him and what it said. Now pull this into your own life, because Cato's situation is not as far from yours as it might seem. You don't live in Rome, but you live somewhere, and somewhere you live there is a version of the thing Cato was facing. The workplace where a practice you know is wrong has become so standard that pointing it out marks you as naive rather than honest. The social circle where a certain kind of cruelty is called humor and objecting would cost you membership. The institution you are part of that has developed a gap between what it claims to stand for and what it actually does. And the unwritten rule is that noticing the gap publicly is the real offense. The question Cato's life forces is specific. At what point does being realistic become being complicit? Because the line between those two things is where most people live. And most people have never actually examined where they stand on it. He lost. Caesar won. The Republic ended anyway. If you're keeping score that way, Cato's entire life was a failed project. And yet, his name is still attached to integrity in a way that none of his more successful contemporaries can claim. Cicero compromised and survived and was eventually murdered anyway. Brutus assassinated Caesar and lost a civil war. The men who adapted most skillfully to power ended up just as dead. And most of them are remembered primarily as footnotes to someone else's story. Cato is remembered because he was the one person in that entire era who didn't need the outcome to go his way in order to stand where he stood. That's the thing about integrity in a corrupted system. It doesn't always save the system. It doesn't always save you. What it does is leave a record that someone saw clearly and said so. And in the long accounting of history, that record tends to outlast almost everything built by the people who were being practical. The system didn't deserve him. Most systems don't deserve the people who refuse to lie to them. Subscribe if you're tired of wisdom that tells you what you want to hear.